by John Stewart, campaigns manager at the RLA, and John very kindly was a panellist on my tax panel. And John, we had about 80 landlords in there, and very much still confusion about the best way forwards for landlords with respect to clause 24.
Yeah, it's the key thing about the tax changes is that landlords need to understand that every set of circumstances is different and people really do need individual advice. There's some general steps that landlords can go through to check their own finances against the legislation, but ultimately people's personal employment, how their property business is structured, where their profits come from, their level of gearing, are all individual, and these all need to be taken into account. So while there's some general guidance being given round about taxation, people really do need to get personal advice.
Indeed, and that was a point that we stressed very much in the panel. And I think one of the other interesting things on this topic is that the RLA has just completed their survey, and it's actually becoming increasingly obvious that this is a tenant tax. What sort of findings have the RLA had?
Well, when the initial announcement round about mortgage interest relief came out last year, we did a survey of members, and around 65% were looking at increasing rents. But with the addition of the stamp duty premium and the changes to capital gains tax, which property profits have now been excluded from as well, and other regulatory changes coming in, post-budget this year, we're finding that over 80% of landlords are now considering raising rents for their tenants. So it's a clear case of the government changes are going to impact on both supply and affordability for tenants.
And you're obviously, as part of your campaign work, you're feeding that back to the Treasury.
We are. We've had fairly regular meetings with the Treasury, HMRC and the Bank of England trying to lay out the impact of the tax changes, trying to explain how it will affect property supply, how it will affect rents, and actually how it will affect the ability of those who are renting at present to buy in the future. It's not just about rents rising and becoming less and less affordable. That means that it's becoming more and more difficult for those rented to put money aside for deposits. And with the lending restrictions and the lending criteria through the mortgage market review being much tougher now, that is becoming probably the critical issue for people going into first-time home ownership.
Now, you've had a very big uptake in membership at the RLA in recent months. Are you getting the feeling that landlords are realising that they must join a professional body and they must have that voice, and that we need to be a united front on this?
It really is so important. We've seen quite a rapid increase in membership. We hit our 20,000 member milestone in September last year, and already in February this year we've hit 23,000. And it's quite clear that legislation does make people rethink their own position. Landlords have been seen as an easy target. They're portrayed as greedy, they're portrayed as not caring. There's a real negative narrative round about private renting and landlords, and the government have been able to tap into that narrative and really clobber landlords in terms of tax and further regulation of the sector. And we need to change that image and perception of landlords. At the end of the day, over 80% of tenants are happy with their landlord and happy with the property. But also, it shows that the government has picked off landlords because we're seen as being unorganised. There's between 1.4 and 2 million landlords out there, depending on whose figures you believe. Only around 60,000 are members of a landlord association in any shape or form. And until that number really grows, and associations like the RLA can go to the Treasury and go to government ministers and say, we are speaking for 100,000, 200,000 people, the government really will get away with attacking the sector in the way that it has. We need those numbers. We need that credibility when we go and argue with government. And it also means that landlords need to be much smarter in terms of lobbying their local MPs as well. It's so important to write a letter to your MP, go and visit your MP, tell them how the tax changes are impacting on your business model, but also how it's impacting on your tenants. And make sure you tell your tenants why you're having to increase rents so they can go and talk to their MP as well.
No, very good point. And I think it's interesting you mentioned there, we don't actually know how many private sector landlords there are in the UK. A lot of them will be landlords with one or two properties that don't even know they're a landlord because they're in full-time employment. So these landlords, I almost see it as a two-phase kind of effect. The more professional landlords are aware of Clause 24 and are planning for it, but we've got this whole second phase of landlords that aren't actually going to realise the impact until they do their tax return in 2017 onwards. Those landlords are going to get a very nasty shock, and they haven't planned.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a huge body of landlords out there who have either bought the Chancellor's rhetoric that it's only going to affect 1 in 5 landlords, and they think, well, that isn't me. Or they think it won't affect basic rate taxpayers, but they forget that interest payments will now be considered as taxable income, so people may well get pulled up a tax bracket. Our survey of members showed that over 60% of landlords will be moved up a tax bracket by the changes to mortgage interest relief. And then, as you say, there's the ignorant middle, if you like, people who either don't realise they're a landlord or don't think legislation applies to them. Yeah. And it's really incumbent upon people to understand their own tax situation, take advice and act. And one of the most effective ways of doing that at the moment is to join an association and to begin the process of lobbying your MP, contacting the people who make these decisions and who quite often themselves don't understand the full implications. We have a tax campaign website where landlords can log on. It's not just for RLA members, it's for all landlords, and there's a template letter there for landlords to send to their MP. There's also a middle section that's blank where people can put in their own experience of how they're being affected and how their tenants are being affected. There's a guide on meeting your MP, how to find out when their local surgeries are and the sort of issues to raise when you meet your MP face to face. And there's guidance there as well for tenants who may also want to go and tell their MP why their rents are rising.
Brilliant. Well, we'll put the address of that standalone website below the video. Thanks very much for joining us, John. Thank you for RLA's support of property tribes. And I think together, we can be a united voice, reach out to landlords and get more awareness of this issue.
Yeah. Absolutely. The key thing is volume. We know that governments listen when their MPs' mailbags are full of letters, and that's where landlords need to get to over all of these changes that's affecting the sector at the moment. So absolutely, sites like Property Tribes, associations like the Residential Landlords Association are absolutely key to getting our message out there.